I grew up in an isolated orphanage, deep in the countryside, far from the hustle and bustle of the big cities. The building, old and weathered by time, was made of aged wood, its boards creaking with every movement, creating a sense that the place itself was alive. At first, I thought this sound was part of the orphanage's charm, a unique allure that made it special, but as time went on, a sense of unease began to invade me. I started to notice that something was wrong. The other children, always in groups, whispered to each other about things that happened at night. They spoke of objects moving on their own, ghostly laughter echoing through the empty hallways, and, most disturbing of all, a feeling that something was watching, waiting, always coming from the dark room at the end of the hall. It was a presence that no one could explain, but everyone could feel. On one of the most unsettling nights, I woke up in the middle of silence to the sound of footsteps. They weren't the soft footsteps of children moving in their sleep, nor the noise of staff getting ready for the night. They were heavy, slow steps, as if something was being dragged down the hallway. The sound seemed to crawl along the walls, reverberating in my ears. My heart raced with fear, and I looked around, searching for signs that anyone else was awake, but the dormitory was immersed in silence. The fear grew, but curiosity pushed me forward. Unsure whether I was being brave or simply reckless, I decided to investigate. I carefully got up, grabbed a flashlight, and started walking down the hallway. Even with fear paralyzing me, I knew I wouldn't be able to sleep until I figured out what was happening. The hallway was empty, but the footsteps continued to echo as if coming from a floor below. A chill ran down my spine, but I didn't turn back. With quick steps, I descended the stairs, my flashlight trembling in my hands. The orphanage was in complete silence, but the sound of footsteps seemed even closer. When I reached the lower floor, the scene I found is something I will never be able to forget. The storage room door, which had always been locked, was now wide open. A shiver ran through my entire body, and although my instinct told me to turn back, something pushed me to take one more step into that dark and unknown place. Inside the storage room, everything seemed normal at first glance, but a strange feeling washed over me when the flashlight illuminated the dark corner. There, in a dimly lit corner, was an old chair, covered by a thin layer of dust, and on it a porcelain doll with a crooked, macabre smile. That smile seemed almost ironic, as if it knew something I didn't. I didn't remember seeing that doll before, and it definitely wasn't there during the day, when I passed through the room for the last time. The fear began to grow inside me, a sense that the doll shouldn't be there, a malevolent presence hiding behind that smile. When I took a step closer, a low, almost imperceptible sound began to fill the air. It was as if someone was whispering, but the words were incomprehensible, a senseless murmur. It was then that, before my eyes, the doll slowly turned its head in an impossible way. Panic took over me, and without thinking, I ran out of the room, stumbling on the stairs as the feeling of being watched chased me. The next day, I felt exhausted and confused, trying to rationalize what had happened the previous night. I decided to tell Clara, a close friend, in the hope that she could help me understand what I had seen. However, when I finished speaking, she looked at me with a strange expression, as if she knew more than she was willing to reveal. "Did you see the doll?" she asked, her tone almost familiar. Those words unsettled me even more. Clara, with an air of someone telling a secret, began to tell me a story that no one at the orphanage had ever mentioned. She told me that years ago, a girl had disappeared without a trace, and when the staff searched for her, they found only the porcelain doll in the place where she used to play. The doll was locked in the storage room, with the hope that no one would go near it again. Clara seemed frightened as she spoke, and I began to understand that there was something much darker about all of this than the adults had tried to hide. The feeling that the orphanage's story was much more than it seemed, and that this doll was somehow connected to the disappearance of the girl, completely consumed me. We decided we would never go near that room again. But what happened the next night proved that our decision didn't matter. That night, fear seemed to follow me like a shadow, but the hope that what I had seen was just a nightmare kept me silent. When I woke up in the middle of the night, my eyes heavy with sleep, my vision was taken over by a scene that made me freeze with terror. In the middle of the dormitory, exactly where I had left my toys and clothes, was the porcelain doll back again, sitting on the floor as if it had been placed there deliberately. I stood frozen for a moment, unable to believe what I was seeing. The doll was back, in the center of our space, as if waiting for our next reaction. What had seemed like a mere coincidence now felt like a warning. Fear took over me again, and I couldn't stop the growing panic. The doll was no longer just an object from the past. It seemed to have a will of its own, something evil, that wouldn't let us be at peace. Things began to worsen from that night when the doll appeared in the middle of the dormitory. Each night seemed to bring something more sinister than the last. Doors slammed shut on their own, as if someone were pushing them forcefully from the inside out. Strange shadows moved through the hallways, even when there was no light to cast them, forming shapes that seemed to stretch and disappear in the blink of an eye. The worst of it all were the voices. Low voices, almost inaudible, but still clear enough for us to recognize our own names being called, echoing through the silence of the early hours. I could barely sleep anymore. The fear of being watched consumed me with every passing hour. It wasn't just the mystery of the doll anymore, but a constant atmosphere of terror, as if the entire orphanage were a great supernatural prison where no one was safe. Some children began to fall ill without explanation. Others reported nightmares so vivid and terrifying that they couldn't remember the details upon waking. Clara, who had always been my friend and the bravest among us, started avoiding me. She seemed to grow more distant, as if carrying a burden that made her fear even her own shadow. The situation worsened further when, one night, Clara simply disappeared. No one could say what happened or where she went. When the staff finally realized, the only sign that she had been there was an object that no one could ignore. The doll. It was there, on her bed, sitting as if it were a gift left behind. Terror took over the place. The other children began whispering, fearful that Clara had been taken by the same presence that haunted us. I tried to understand what had happened, but everything seemed like a nightmare we couldn't wake up from. The orphanage became a place of mystery, where nothing made sense anymore, and where, little by little, we were being consumed by the darkness. The staff grew more distant, as if they were as intimidated as we were, and the children became afraid to talk about what really happened behind those walls. I don't know how I managed to survive all of this until I was finally adopted and left that place. The terror and the feeling of helplessness became so intense that deep down, I knew I couldn't live there forever. But even years later, something still haunts me. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, I wake up in a cold sweat, with the feeling that something is watching me, as if the doll's eyes were still fixed on me. The sound of heavy, slow, dragging footsteps still echoes in my ears, as if that presence is trying to reach me, to take me back to that place. I try to ignore it, try to convince myself that it was all just a nightmare. But deep down, I know that the doll's story isn't over yet. Working in an orphanage was never part of my plans. I was going through a tough time, unemployed, and with few options, until this opportunity came up. The structure of the place was impressive, an old building with heavy architecture and walls that seemed to carry the weight of decades. The air there had something peculiar, something that made me feel constantly uncomfortable, as if the environment was hiding some dark secret. The children were mostly cheerful, and their smiles were genuine. However, there was something in their eyes, a depth of gaze, that left me with the feeling that they knew something I shouldn't know. I tried to ignore this impression, telling myself it was probably just my mind. But as the days went by, the feeling didn't fade. At night, when I finally lay down to sleep, I convinced myself that I was just making up a story in my head, trying to push away any discomfort. One particular night, I was assigned to the midnight shift. My job was simple: make sure the children were all in their rooms and that the environment remained completely quiet, with no issues. However, around 2 in the morning, while walking through the hallways, I heard footsteps, as if someone were walking quickly down the main corridor. It wasn't unusual for the children to get up to go to the bathroom, so without thinking too much, I decided to check. But when I reached the hallway, it was completely empty. The bedroom doors were all closed, and the silence was so absolute that I could hear my own heartbeat. It was a dense silence, as if something were watching. I looked around but saw nothing that could explain the sound I had just heard. At first, I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I continued my way, trying to convince myself that nothing strange was happening. But then, the sound of footsteps returned, and this time it seemed to come from behind me. I froze. The hallway was still empty, and I saw no one around. The dim light above me flickered intermittently, casting strange shadows on the walls. I didn't know what was happening, but I felt a presence, a sensation of being watched. Fear began to take over, and the instinct to quickly return to the safety of the children's rooms kicked in. But no matter how much I tried to rationalize it, something in the air in that place felt wrong, and I couldn't explain what it was. The following week, I decided to speak with the cook, an elderly woman who had worked at the orphanage for more than 20 years. I was curious to know if she had ever noticed anything strange around there. She sighed deeply, as if she were pondering the best way to tell me something that had been bothering her for a long time. She looked around, almost as if she feared someone might overhear her. Then, in a low voice full of mystery, she said, "This place has stories, my child. Long before you started here, a girl named Clara disappeared. They searched for her for days but never found her. Some children say she's still here." I nervously laughed, trying to lighten the conversation, but something about the story deeply unsettled me. No matter how much I tried to ignore it, the cook's words kept echoing in my head, and the feeling that something was wrong in that place only grew stronger. From that moment on, I began to notice other strange details that I had previously overlooked. Whispers that seemed to come from nowhere, toys that moved on their own, and the sound of children's laughter echoing through the house in the middle of the night. I no longer knew what to think. The line between reason and fear began to blur before me. In my last month of work, the events intensified. During one of my night rounds, I found an old doll sitting right in the middle of the hallway. I was sure it hadn't been there before, but I decided to ignore it. However, something made me stop. As I approached the doll, I noticed something on the floor, as if someone had written a message there. The words were written in shaky letters, as if by a child. They formed a simple sentence, but one that sent chills down my spine. "Can you play with me?" Panic overtook me. I wanted to leave, but something stopped me. Before I could react, the sound of a creaking door echoed down the hallway, making my heart race. It was the cleaning closet door, which I knew had been locked. Now it was ajar, and a cold draft came from it, accompanied by a muffled laugh, something so disturbing it almost made me lose control. Fear was in every corner of that place, and I knew I could no longer ignore the signs. What was happening in that orphanage went beyond any logical explanation. Every detail, every sound, seemed to carry a dark weight. I could no longer tell whether what I was seeing and hearing was real or just in my mind, but what I felt was undeniable. Something was wrong, and the presence of that girl, Clara, seemed more alive than ever. As if she still wandered the hallways, trying to communicate with me, or with anyone who was willing to listen to her silent stories. The fear of uncovering the truth seemed greater than anything else, but it was too late to turn back. I gathered all the courage I could to open the closet door, my heart pounding hard, almost jumping out of my chest. With every step, the anxiety grew. When the door finally opened, I expected to find something that would explain the strange happenings, but all I found was an empty closet. However, the floor was covered in dust, and a figure was drawn there, as if a child had made it with their fingers. It was a stick figure, with one hand extended toward another, smaller figure, and what made my blood run cold was what was written above the larger figure. My name. My body froze. I couldn't understand what it meant, but before I could think further, the hallway lights began to flicker, then completely went out, plunging everything into darkness. I stood there, motionless, with the feeling that someone was watching me. Fear took over, and before I could react, I heard a soft voice, almost a whisper, coming from behind me. "Now we are friends." As I turned around, I saw a small silhouette, a girl, but before I could scream, she vanished as if she had never been there. The fear and shock were so overwhelming that I couldn't process it right away. Something inside me knew that place wasn't safe, but my mind, desperate to understand, kept searching for explanations. The next day, I couldn't bear it any longer. I quit without giving any explanations, just saying that I needed to leave, and I didn't look back. Somehow, I knew that place wasn't for me, and there was something much deeper and scarier there, something I couldn't comprehend. To this day, that orphanage hasn't left my mind. Whenever I close my eyes to sleep, I'm invaded by nightmares of those dark hallways, the whispers, and the children's laughter. The feeling of being watched has never left me. No matter how much I try to convince myself it was just stress, something inside me can't forget the events of that night. I never went back there, but in my mind, one question remains. Was Clara really there? Or did she follow me home? The footsteps at night, the chill down my spine. I still don't know if it's my imagination or if somehow she never left me. And if one day you hear footsteps in the middle of the night, I suggest you don't look back. It might just be your imagination, or perhaps not.